I never imagined that decorating my own balcony would turn into a neighborhood scandal, but there it was, a formal complaint filed against me for making my own space unsightly. I stood there, staring at the letter taped to my door, my hands tightening around the crisp paper as I read the absurd accusations. My heart pounded as my eyes flicked toward the balcony, the very same one I had spent weeks carefully decorating with warm fairy lights, handcrafted wind chimes, and a few colorful potted plants. It wasn't gaudy or cluttered, it was personal, a tiny oasis I had built to escape the suffocating monotony of everyday life. But now, someone, my ever-watchful neighbor, had decided that my happiness was a direct offense to their perfect suburban aesthetic. I clenched my jaw, scanning the street, half expecting to see eyes peering from behind curtains, waiting to witness my reaction. And that's when I spotted her, Mrs. Parker, standing across the road, arms crossed, lips curled in that ever-judgmental sneer. It was her. It had to be. I stepped back inside, shutting the door with more force than necessary, the letter still crumpled in my grip. The words replayed in my mind, each one more ridiculous than the last. Disrupts neighborhood harmony, unapproved aesthetic, detracts from property values. Property values? My balcony wasn't some neon-lit monstrosity or an abandoned junkyard, it was a carefully curated retreat. And yet, someone had gone through the effort of formally reporting it, probably relishing in the power trip of dictating what was and wasn't acceptable. I let out a slow breath, forcing myself to think. There were two ways to handle this. I could quietly comply, remove my decorations, and pretend like this never happened, or I could fight back. The choice should have been obvious. The next morning, I stepped onto my balcony, deliberately taking my time watering the plants, adjusting the wind chimes so they sang just the right melody in the gentle breeze. If they wanted to call it unsightly, then they could watch as I made it even more beautiful. Mrs. Parker's gaze was glued to me from her perfectly trimmed garden, her nose wrinkled in visible disapproval. I ignored her, resisting the urge to smirk as I reached for the string lights, ensuring they hung just a little more symmetrically than before. A battle had been declared, and I wasn't going to back down. Hours passed before the next escalation arrived, a knock at my door, sharp and purposeful. My stomach tightened as I opened it to find a man in an official-looking uniform standing before me, clipboard in hand. "There's been a complaint about your balcony decorations," he announced, his tone carefully neutral, though his eyes flicked toward the string lights glowing softly behind me. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. Of course, she had wasted no time. As he continued talking, explaining the community guidelines and how my decorations were allegedly in violation, I felt a slow, simmering anger take hold. "You have 48 hours to comply," he finished, handing me another notice before walking away, leaving me standing there with the taste of defiance on my tongue. 48 hours. 2 days to erase my personal touch from my own home. I glanced back at my balcony, its glow soft against the evening sky, and knew one thing for certain: this was far from overdone. I refused to let my sanctuary be stripped away just because someone with too much time on their hands decided it didn't fit their vision of the neighborhood. The moment the official left, I unfolded the notice again, reading through the vague wording designed to sound authoritative but ultimately empty. Nowhere did it explicitly state what constituted an unsightly balcony, and that ambiguity gave me an advantage. I wasn't breaking any real rules, I was being targeted. The next morning, I walked outside with a quiet determination, making a show of straightening the potted plants, tightening the fairy lights, and adjusting the hanging lanterns to sit just right. I knew eyes were watching, hidden behind curtains and blinds, waiting to see if I would fold under pressure. Mrs. Parker had positioned herself in her usual spot, watering the same patch of grass she always did when she was pretending not to spy. Her expression was tight, her disapproval radiating like heat off pavement. I ignored her, savoring the fact that my presence alone was enough to disrupt her day. Hours passed before the first sign of retaliation arrived. A second letter, this time thicker, stuffed into my mailbox. I pulled it out, scanning the words and feeling my irritation grow with every line. The complaint had escalated. The decorations were now classified as a visual nuisance, and failure to comply within 24 hours would result in a formal review by the neighborhood board. I could almost hear Mrs. Parker's satisfied huff as she imagined me scrambling to take everything down, but if she thought I would back down so easily, she was mistaken. If this was going to a board review, I would be ready. I spent the rest of the day gathering every piece of documentation I could find, the housing guidelines, photos of other balconies in the neighborhood that had far more extravagant decorations, proof that my lights and plants were well maintained and not violating any safety regulations. I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to expose the hypocrisy. That evening, as I sat on my balcony with a steaming cup of coffee, watching the sunset bathe the sky in warm orange hues, a shadow moved across the street. Mrs. Parker stood near her fence, her phone in hand, her fingers moving furiously as if she were drafting yet another complaint. The thought amused me more than it irritated me. She had spent so much effort trying to control something that had no impact on her life, and I had no doubt she expected me to cave before the board meeting. But instead of feeling anxious, I felt a thrill of anticipation. I had spent too much time in this neighborhood watching people like her dictate what was acceptable and what wasn't, watching them pick and choose their targets, enforcing rules when it suited them and turning a blind eye when it didn't. The meeting was tomorrow, and if they thought they could push me into submission, they had no idea what they were in for. The day of the board meeting arrived, and the weight of unspoken tension clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. I could feel it the moment I stepped outside, neighbors whispering in hushed tones, stolen glances from porches, and the unmistakable presence of Mrs. Parker standing near the community center entrance, her arms crossed in triumph as if she had already won. I had seen this tactic before, the quiet intimidation, the way people like her wielded their influence through fear rather than reason. But today was different. I wasn't going in as a victim, I was walking into that meeting armed with the truth. The community center was packed when I arrived, every seat filled with familiar faces, some indifferent, some concerned, and a few watching with the kind of amusement that suggested they had been waiting for someone to challenge the unspoken hierarchy. The board members sat at the front, stiff-backed and unreadable, except for one, the chairman, an older man who had lived in the neighborhood for years and who had always operated under the illusion of fairness. I took my seat near the middle, meeting Mrs. Parker's glare without flinching as the meeting was called to order. The accusations came quickly, delivered in the same patronizing tone I had come to expect. My balcony, I was told, was an eyesore, a disruption to the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. It clashed with the uniform appearance that the community prided itself on, and there had been multiple complaints about its intrusive presence. They spoke as if I had covered my balcony in flashing neon signs and discarded junk, as if it were a public offense rather than a personal expression of home. I waited, letting them say everything they needed to, letting Mrs. Parker revel in her moment of superiority as she sat with a self-satisfied smirk. Then, when the room had settled into expectant silence, I stood, unfolding the documents I had spent the last day preparing. I laid out my defense methodically, countering every point with undeniable facts. The housing guidelines did not explicitly prohibit decorations as long as they were well maintained and did not pose a safety hazard. I presented photographs of other balconies in the neighborhood, some adorned with seasonal decorations, others with far more elaborate displays than mine, yet none of those had ever been reported. The pattern was clear, the selective enforcement glaringly obvious. A murmur rippled through the room as I went further, detailing the history of complaints in the neighborhood, how certain individuals seemed to escape scrutiny while others, like myself, became repeated targets. It wasn't about aesthetics, it was about control. The board shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the meeting they had expected to be a simple reprimand had turned into something much larger. Mrs. Parker's smug expression faltered, the realization creeping in that I wasn't just defending my right to decorate my balcony, I was exposing the way people like her had manipulated the rules for years. The chairman cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the discussion, but the shift had already happened. The board could no longer dismiss the conversation as a minor issue of neighborhood harmony. The evidence was there, undeniable, and for the first time, the power Mrs. Parker had wielded so effortlessly was slipping through her fingers. The silence in the room stretched uncomfortably as my words settled over the board members like a heavy weight they hadn't anticipated carrying. I could see the subtle shift in their expressions, the way some of them exchanged glances, unsure how to proceed now that their authority was being questioned in front of an audience that had begun to murmur among themselves. This was no longer about my balcony, it was about the way the rules had been bent to suit certain people while others were subjected to arbitrary enforcement. I kept my stance firm, letting the room absorb the truth of the situation, watching as the carefully constructed illusion of control began to crack. Mrs. Parker's fingers were curled tightly around the edges of her stack of complaints, her knuckles white, her previous confidence wavering as the board hesitated to deliver the swift punishment she had expected. I could feel the energy in the room shifting, the slow but steady realization among the neighbors that they had been living under an unspoken hierarchy where only a select few decided what was acceptable. One of the board members cleared his throat and shuffled through his papers, avoiding my gaze as he hesitated before speaking. He acknowledged that, based on the guidelines, there was no clear violation in my decorations. His voice lacked conviction, as if he were grasping for a way to reassert authority without outright admitting they had acted unfairly. Another member, an older woman with a cautious but perceptive expression, asked why this particular complaint had escalated so quickly when similar cases had been ignored. That was the moment I knew I had won, not just for myself but for everyone who had ever been on the receiving end of this selective enforcement. The board was cornered. If they ruled against me, they would have to justify why others had been exempt from similar scrutiny. If they ruled in my favor, it would mean acknowledging that Mrs. Parker's complaint had no real foundation beyond personal bias. Either way, their credibility had been publicly questioned, and there was no easy way out. I could see Mrs. Parker's frustration bubbling beneath the surface, the way her lips pressed into a thin line, her pride preventing her from backing down despite the undeniable shift in the room. She attempted one last desperate appeal, insisting that my decorations disrupted the uniformity of the neighborhood, that personal preference should not outweigh community standards. But the words sounded weak now, hollow in the face of logic and fairness. The very people who had once nodded along to her grievances were now second-guessing their support, realizing that siding with her meant aligning with rules that could just as easily be turned against them. The board finally made their decision, a non-committal statement about needing more time to review the complaint, an obvious attempt to stall, to escape the immediate consequences of confrontation. But I didn't need an immediate ruling to know that the battle had already been won. The moment the meeting adjourned, the moment people began murmuring among themselves and exchanging knowing glances, I knew that something had shifted permanently. The power dynamic had changed. The next move belonged to me, and I had no intention of letting this fight end quietly. As the meeting dispersed, I felt the weight of countless eyes trailing me, some filled with quiet approval, others with uncertainty, and a few, like Mrs. Parker's, brimming with barely contained resentment. The air outside was thick with tension, a lingering discomfort that clung to those who had spent years unchallenged, their control never questioned, until now. I walked home without speaking to anyone, though I could hear hushed conversations beginning behind me, neighbors murmuring in low voices, their opinions shifting like tectonic plates beneath the surface. The realization was slow but inevitable: if they had allowed Mrs. Parker's complaint to stand unchallenged, what else had they accepted as truth simply because it had been presented with enough authority? That was the real victory, not just my balcony but the doubt now creeping into the foundation of their obedience. That night, as I stood on my balcony, the glow of my carefully placed lights casting a warm hue against the darkness, I let the events of the day settle in. I had expected resistance, but I hadn't expected the cracks in their control to spread so quickly. What had started as a single complaint against my decorations had unraveled into something much larger: questions about fairness, about power, about who truly dictated the rules in this neighborhood. The notice pinned to my door had been meant as a warning, an attempt to remind me that I was being watched, that I was expected to conform. Instead, it had exposed a system built on nothing but unspoken agreements, a hierarchy that relied on the silent acceptance of those beneath it. I took a deep breath, watching as a shadow moved across the street, lingering just long enough to confirm what I already knew. Mrs. Parker was restless. She had spent years wielding her influence without challenge, and now, for the first time, she was facing the possibility that her voice alone was no longer enough. The next morning, I woke to find another letter in my mailbox, this one hastily folded, its edges creased as though it had been delivered in frustration. I opened it slowly, already anticipating the desperate attempt at reasserting control. The words were sharper this time, less restrained, less veiled in the carefully worded legalese of the previous complaints. It was a personal note from Mrs. Parker herself, an attempt to intimidate me into submission now that the board had failed to do so. She spoke of tradition, of community standards, of the importance of keeping the neighborhood pristine for future residents. There was no official signature, no mention of the board. This wasn't an enforcement letter, it was a plea disguised as a warning. The fact that she had resorted to this meant she knew she was losing. I folded the letter, slipping it into my pocket before stepping onto my balcony, making sure to adjust the wind chimes just enough so that their sound carried through the air. If she wanted to pretend this was about aesthetics, I was going to make sure she saw beauty in every inch of what she had tried so hard to erase. The war wasn't over, but the battlefield had shifted, and for the first time, she was fighting from a position of weakness. The sun rose over the neighborhood with an unsettling stillness, the kind that followed an unspoken confrontation where no one dared to acknowledge the shift in power. I could feel it in the way people moved, slower, more deliberate, their gazes flicking toward my balcony as if expecting some drastic retaliation, some grand escalation. But I had no intention of rushing into chaos. This wasn't a battle to be won with reckless defiance, it was a game of endurance, and I had the patience to watch it unfold. The letter from Mrs. Parker sat on my desk, a silent reminder that she had abandoned official channels and resorted to personal intimidation, a move that reeked of desperation. If she had truly believed in her authority, she wouldn't have needed to send that note in secrecy. She had expected compliance, the kind that came from years of conditioned obedience, and when she didn't get it, she panicked. That alone was enough to tell me she was unraveling. I went about my day as if nothing had changed, watering my plants with slow, purposeful movements, adjusting the lanterns, ensuring every element of my balcony was exactly as I intended it to be. The wind carried the soft chime of hanging ornaments, a quiet defiance that whispered through the air for anyone who cared to listen. I could sense the eyes watching from behind curtains, the tension brewing just beneath the surface of the neighborhood's forced tranquility. Mrs. Parker had spent years curating an illusion of control, and now, with every passing moment where her complaints yielded no consequences, that illusion was slipping. She had expected swift action from the board, an immediate response that would put me back in my place, but instead, she was met with hesitation, with neighbors who were beginning to question the structure they had so blindly followed. Doubt was a powerful weapon, and it was spreading like cracks in glass, impossible to ignore once they had formed. By midday, another letter arrived, this time not from Mrs. Parker but from the board itself. I took my time opening it, already anticipating the carefully crafted wording designed to mask their uncertainty. It was a formal response, a weak attempt to regain control by stating that a final decision on my decorations would require further review, that the board would need additional time to assess the situation before any action could be taken. It was an obvious retreat, a way to buy themselves time while they figured out how to navigate the scrutiny now placed upon them. They had realized what Mrs. Parker had failed to. This was no longer just about a balcony. It was about the precedent they would set, about whether they could continue enforcing rules without question, or if this was the moment their authority would begin to erode. I folded the letter carefully, setting it aside as I stepped back outside, letting the warmth of the sun settle against my skin. The neighborhood was unusually quiet, the usual background hum of daily life replaced with an almost expectant silence. Across the street, Mrs. Parker stood near her garden, her expression carefully neutral, but the tightness in her posture betrayed the storm brewing beneath the surface. She was waiting, watching, searching for the next move. But I had already made mine. I had forced them all to hesitate, to second-guess, to consider possibilities they had never entertained before. And in a system built on blind acceptance, hesitation was the first step toward collapse. The battle wasn't over, but the foundation of their authority had begun to crack. Now, all I had to do was wait for it to crumble. The waiting game stretched into days, each one a silent test of patience, a contest to see who would break first. The board had retreated into deliberation, caught in their own web of indecision, and Mrs. Parker had grown increasingly restless, her usual composure fraying at the edges. I could see it in the way she paced her front yard, in the way her gaze lingered on my balcony longer than before, no longer just disapproving but calculating, searching for an alternative way to reassert control. She had spent years ensuring that her word was final, that her approval was the invisible currency that determined who belonged in this neighborhood and who did not. And now, with every passing day where no action was taken against me, that power slipped further from her grasp. It was in the cautious nods I received from neighbors who once avoided eye contact, in the way conversations lingered longer on sidewalks, murmurs of change rippling beneath the surface of the neighborhood's forced uniformity. The realization was settling in, slow but undeniable: if I could stand my ground and challenge their authority, so could anyone else. Then, as if sensing the shift, Mrs. Parker made her final move. A new notice appeared on my doorstep, but this one was different. It wasn't from the board or any official committee, it was a petition, hastily drafted, its edges slightly crumpled as if written in frustration. She had taken matters into her own hands, rallying support from those who still clung to the illusion of control, the ones who feared change more than they questioned authority. The petition demanded stricter regulations, an amendment to the housing guidelines that would give the board unilateral power to determine what was and wasn't acceptable for public-facing properties. It was a last-ditch effort, an attempt to codify her personal vendetta into an enforceable rule before the board's hesitation unraveled everything she had built. But the cracks were already too deep, the doubt too widespread. I didn't need to tear down her petition to see that it had failed before it even started. The neighborhood was no longer blindly following, and the weight of unchallenged authority had begun to shift. The board's delay had made them appear weak, indecisive, no longer the unquestionable enforcers of suburban order. The people who had once nodded along to Mrs. Parker's vision of perfection were now questioning why they had ever let her speak for them in the first place. The power she had wielded so effortlessly had always been an illusion, built on compliance rather than genuine authority. And now, with that compliance eroding, there was nothing left to uphold the illusion. By the end of the week, an announcement was made, one that solidified the final blow. The board, under increasing scrutiny, issued a statement declaring that the complaint against my balcony had been reviewed and dismissed, citing the lack of clear violations and the need for fairness in enforcement. More than that, they announced a review of the existing guidelines, a reassessment of the very rules that had allowed selective targeting in the first place. It wasn't just a victory for me, it was a turning point for the entire neighborhood. The balance of power had shifted, and for the first time, those who had lived under the quiet weight of arbitrary rules saw the possibility of change. Mrs. Parker's influence shattered in the days that followed, her frustration giving way to resignation as the support she had counted on slipped through her fingers. The neighbors who once echoed her concerns no longer spoke in certainty, their loyalty eroded by the realization that they had been complicit in a system that no longer served them. She withdrew, retreating into the quiet isolation of a ruler who had lost her kingdom. The battle she had waged against my balcony had ended, not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the slow, undeniable unraveling of the authority she had spent years constructing. And as I stood on my balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of amber and violet, I knew that this fight had never truly been about decorations or aesthetics. It had been about control, about the right to exist without bending to the whims of those who mistook their personal preferences for law. The lights glowed softly around me, undisturbed, unchanged, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt just a little freer. The days that followed felt like the settling of dust after a long-fought storm, the kind where silence carried more weight than any spoken words. The neighborhood had shifted, its rhythm altered in ways that could not be undone. Where once there had been hushed compliance, now there was conversation. Neighbors who had spent years keeping their heads down now found their voices, speaking about things they had long accepted without question. The board's decision had not just dismissed a complaint, it had opened a door that had remained locked for too long. Questions were being asked, not just about my balcony but about the many rules that had been upheld without reason, about the fines and citations that had been handed down without challenge. The control that had ruled this place for years was crumbling, not in a dramatic collapse but in the quiet unraveling of obedience. Mrs. Parker's presence grew fainter, her movements less pronounced, as if she were trying to cling to invisibility in a neighborhood that no longer looked at her with the quiet reverence she had once commanded. The petition she had drafted disappeared as quickly as it had come, and the few signatures she had gathered carried no weight against the tide of indifference that met it. She no longer stood in her yard with watchful eyes, no longer paraded through the streets with the air of unchallenged authority. It wasn't defeat in the way she had likely imagined, not a singular moment of collapse, but rather the slow erosion of power, the realization that no one was listening anymore. She had wielded control not through rules but through unspoken expectation, through the assumption that her word would always carry more weight than those around her. And now, with that expectation shattered, there was nothing left to uphold her influence. The final confirmation of her downfall came in the form of a small, unceremonious notice, an announcement that Mrs. Parker had stepped down from her position in the community association, citing personal reasons. There was no grand farewell, no attempt to justify the departure, just a quiet withdrawal from the stage she had ruled for years. And just like that, the reign of control that had dictated so much of this neighborhood's existence ended with little more than a brief mention in the association's newsletter. The irony was not lost on me. She had spent years enforcing rules that she had crafted to maintain her version of order, only to find herself pushed out by the very community she had sought to govern. The evening after the announcement, I stepped onto my balcony, the air carrying the familiar hum of a neighborhood that felt lighter than it had in years. The lights glowed warmly, the wind chimes sang their quiet melody, and for the first time since this all began, I felt the undeniable weight of victory. Not just for myself, but for every person in this neighborhood who had ever swallowed their frustration, who had ever altered their choices to avoid conflict, who had ever allowed someone else's opinion to dictate their own space. The battle had been long, subtle, fought in glances and whispers, in hesitation and unspoken defiance. But in the end, the lesson had been clear: power only exists as long as people believe in it, and the moment that belief fades, even the strongest rulers become nothing more than relics of a past no one fears anymore.